a space for dialogue with leading figures where we explore their trajectories, ideas, and contributions to the future of taxation. This episode focuses on one of the most intellectually stimulating discussions in international taxation, the relationship between, on one hand, global justice, and on the other, the ongoing reshaping of the international tax system. Drawing on his recent article published in the Journal of International Economic Law from the Oxford University Press 2025, our today's guest analyzes how recent reforms led by the OECD, particularly the two-pillar solution, are redefining fiscal sovereignty and reigniting fundamental questions about fairness, distributive equity, and political power in the design of the global tax rules. Our guest today is Professor Ivan Ozai, or Ivan Ozai, if we employ the Brazilian pronunciation. He's Associate Professor at Queen's University Faculty of Law in Canada and holder of the Queen's Faculty Scholar in Tax Law and Policy Chair. His research focuses on national, comparative, and international tax law with a strong emphasis on global tax justice, fiscal competition, and the ethical dimension of taxation. Professor Ozai holds a doctorate in law from the McGill University, and before joining Queen's University, he taught at Osgoode Hall Law School. I hope I have not mispronounced the words, from the York University, where he received the teaching award for full-time faculty. So, Professor Ozai, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. It's a great pleasure for us to have you here.
Thank you, Marcio. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Thanks, Professor. It's a tradition in our program to start by a personal question. We normally like to situate our guest in the topography of the tax field. So to begin, Professor, could you share a little bit about your professional journey? How did you first become interested in the field of taxation in first place? And what led you to explore this intersection between international tax law and global justice, which has become such a major subject in your research?
Right. Well, first of all, as you know, I'm originally from Brazil, so I was born and raised in Brazil. So, olá para o público brasileiro que está nos acompanhando. So I started in tax almost by accident because my first job was as an accountant assistant, and then I became a CPA, a certified public accountant. And then after that, I decided to go to law school. And so in law school, I already had this, let's say, I was already familiar with tax and accounting. And so it was kind of natural for me to focus on tax. But also in law school, I learned a different perspective or facet of tax law, which is this tremendous connection with other broader areas of law, constitutional law in Brazil, and also with philosophy and how pervasive tax is in everyone's lives, in society overall. And so I became passionate, not so much on the technical aspects that I also enjoyed, but also on these broader connections that tax creates. And so I was very interested in academia and the sort of philosophical connections of tax. And so I worked in Brazil as a practitioner. So I was a lawyer in private function. Then I went to work in the government in the state of Sao Paulo. And then I decided to shift to, well, actually I moved to Canada for personal reasons. And at that time, I made the decision to move entirely to academia. And because we did have, and we still do have, many Canadian scholars that focus particularly international tax, I got interested in the debates that were happening. And because of my previous passion of philosophy, I think it was natural for me to get interested in these very kind of nuanced discussions about how can we think about the notion of justice in at the international level, which is already problematic, but also more particularly in tax. So how can we apply this notion of global justice to international tax? And that became one of the topics I have researched and written about the most.
Fascinating, Professor. Yeah, you have not a very typical trajectory, considering how normally Brazilian tax practitioners get involved in the tax field. So it's remarkable your perspective, the way you have seen taxation as a phenomenon, and this is something that connects directly the dialogues with the way we understand taxation here at the ESTB. And just taking advantage of your mention and explain to our audience, even though this is a conversation between two Brazilians, we decided to do so in English because we want to reach a broader audience, an international audience, since this subject is an international subject in essence, and not just a Brazilian subject. So connecting to what you said at the end, Professor, in your recent article, you argued that the world is moving from a single jurisdiction paradigm where taxing rights belongs to one or two states to what you call a shared jurisdiction model. Could you explain what this transition means in practice and why it represents such a major turning point in international taxation?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So you touched upon the very core of the thesis I tried to develop in this argument. And I'm not sure that everybody necessarily will agree with me that we have this transition, and even with this idea of a single paradigm on a single jurisdiction paradigm, that I don't think that's clearly stated in the literature. So part of the argument I try to raise is when you think about tax jurisdiction, in principle, states would be able to tax whatever income that is raised wherever, anywhere. They do have this very extended power to tax. So how do we even think of the limitation that a state has on how much it can tax, right? So one of the most, so let's just use an example that I think I kind of tried to use in the article. Could be in my case. So I was born and raised in Brazil, and I still am a Brazilian citizen. I'm now a Canadian citizen and a Canadian resident, so I don't reside in Brazil anymore. And I could be teaching a course that is for a company that could be based, let's say, in Amsterdam, and they could have students all around the world. So suppose I earn income from that particular activity. So which country should be entitled to tax my income? Would it be Amsterdam? Would it be the countries where the activity is reflecting its outcomes, which is where the students are located? Should it be the country that gave me the educational background for me to be able to perform this work, which would be mostly Brazil, but also a little bit of Canada? So how do we determine which of these countries can tax this particular income that I'm earning at this particular point in time? And so there are different ways to think about this. One would be we could say all of them could tax, right? So they have unlimited power to tax my income, and so both Brazil and Canada and Amsterdam, all these countries could in principle tax, and it would be taxed by all these countries. This would be crazy by most people, but there would be one possibility. The other possibility would be to try to figure out some rules to determine which of these countries would have priority to tax, right? And so a single country could tax in that case. A third possibility would be for a few countries to tax, but then they share part of their tax jurisdiction, so that the tax base would be shared between these countries. So that's also another possibility. What I say in this article is that we generally chose the second one. So most states prefer to avoid double taxation or more than double taxation, and that's why they have bilateral treaties. Even in the absence of bilateral treaties, what many countries will do is to refrain from taxing, from overburdening the taxpayer. So in the end, we end up having a system where generally one country tax or another could tax as well, but the system as a whole is somewhat designed to consider that a single country should have priority to tax, and then maybe a second country could tax a residual amount, right, by crediting how much was taxed in the first stage, and then they would only tax the difference. So this is what I call a single jurisdiction paradigm. We have this kind of conceptual notion that a single country in principle should have the priority to tax. How do we determine which country that is? That's a challenge, and that's one of the main challenges we have today in international tax. But the shift from this model that I'm arguing is that many of the reforms we're seeing seem to be moving to a different system where either multiple countries can tax portions of the tax that wasn't taxed in the original country, or the country that had original priority tax, or we can have just shared jurisdiction, where from the beginning, which is the case of Pillar 1, which I think we're going to discuss in more detail in a moment, what we have is that a particular share of the profits of a group is assigned to specific countries that before they weren't entitled to tax.
If you allow me a short comment, your perspective aligns with a subject which is central here at the ESTB. We have a course on international taxation. I hope we have some students that participate in this course watching this video. If it's the case, I ask you to make a short comment or something. And in our course, we discuss as the major event in the process of internationalization of taxation in the passage from the 19th to the 20th century was the fragmentation of the wealth generation process. What you're emphasizing is that we have maybe a bigger fragmentation. In fact, we discussed the division of the wealth generation process, and you're talking about a major fragmentation of this process. So this is really that poses some challenges for the liberal paradigm, in a way that we have the two people interacting, producing wealth, and the taxation comes to this wealth to take this wealth from the private sector to the public sector, which is a very Smithian way of seeing taxation. So it does not fit to the current reality of the international relations.
Exactly. Yes. The world is becoming more complex, right? So even though I think many of these problems already existed, even in a world of brick and mortar businesses, now it's becoming so pervasive that it's hard. If you think of the tax in the metaverse, for example, which is something somewhat new, we're not sure where the metaverse is going, but if you think that would be a possibility, where do you even consider that the activity is taking place when everything is taking place in the digital space only, right? No physical connection to the world.
So it's difficult to say whether the process of digitalization of the economy has provided new challenges or just shed some light on some ancient problems that we already had and we have not faced properly in the time. But probably the most important discussion, going back to the mainstream debate, the most important discussion concerning the subject, as you mentioned, is the two-pillar solution. And in your article, you suggest that the OECD's two-pillar solution falls short of integrating principles of global justice, which is a central matter in this discussion. So what are, in your view, the main distributional imbalances or biases in these reforms, and why do they tend to benefit wealthier countries in detriment of poorer countries?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And well, as you know, there are many layers to the issue, right? So one, of course, is that from a more skeptical perspective, we know that this is a project that's being led by the OECD, which is called the Rich Countries Club, not without any reason, because the purpose of the OECD is to serve its member countries, and of course you could expect that a project coming from them would be somewhat biased or leaning toward benefiting their membership, right? But if you look at the norms themselves, so what was the purpose of Pillar 1? The purpose of Pillar 1 was to, in a way, broaden the scope of tax jurisdiction by saying that which is something we didn't discuss yet. So what are the main, let's say, factors that we usually consider that determine which country gets to tax a certain income? Would be either the country where the taxpayer that's earning the income resides, and that's what we call residence, or the other nexus would be the source where the activity is taking place, right? Usually these are limited to the existence of somewhat of a physical presence. When you think about source, we require that there's a permanent establishment in a country for the country to be able to tax that income, right? The issue with Pillar 1 was that with the digital economy, we see that a company could be economically present in many jurisdictions without having a physical presence, and that sort of created this movement of countries that we call market jurisdictions, where these multinationals are economically present, but they don't have any physical location there. So how do we assign some jurisdiction, some tax jurisdiction to these countries? And that was sort of the intent behind Pillar 1. I think there are somewhat two problems there. One is that if we are going to expand the scope of the source nexus, one aspect would be which countries benefit from the broadening of the scope, right? But then the other is if we're going to do that, how much are we going to assign to these countries? And the way it was done, it was decided in Pillar 1, was very limiting, and that created a lot of discontent, especially among developing economies that would prefer to have a broader share of the tax base than they were assigned by Pillar 1. So I'd say that Pillar 1, in a way, assigned greater tax jurisdiction to some developing countries, which in this case I'm considering to be market jurisdictions. They are not necessarily developing countries, not all of them, but usually bigger economies. But at least countries like, India, Brazil, China would significantly benefit from this. But they did it in a very limited way. They assigned just a small portion of excess profits. So that limited significantly how much they would be entitled to tax. So I think that's one problem we have. I think when you look at the formula they adopt in amount A of Pillar 1, it is arbitrary. There's no reason to limit it to that amount. So that's one thing. So Pillar 2, the purpose was, and this is controversial, but for me the purpose was to kind of restore the old project from 1998 to limit tax competition, which in itself is problematic to some countries, because some developing countries, the only way they have to attract, or the most important way they have to attract businesses or investments, is through competition. So by removing their ability to do that, I think that first creates one problem. But then the second problem is the way Pillar 2 does it is by saying, if you don't tax that income, I'm going to tax in your place, even if the main, let's say, rules or principles of international tax law would generally not allow me to do that, right? So that's the scenario we're having. So a country that would, in principle, not be entitled to tax that income is taxing on behalf of the country that is not taxing. But then the question could be, so which country is going to do that? So if you have a multinational, a corporate group with subsidiaries all over the world, any of these jurisdictions could in principle tax income that hasn't been taxed in a single jurisdiction. But how does Pillar 2 assign the jurisdiction? It's where the ultimate parent entity is located, which is generally where the capital is, which is generally developed countries, right? So the first rule, who gets priority to tax the income that hasn't been taxed by a specific country under Pillar 1, is going to be basically the richer countries first, and then other countries. And I think that's also one of the main biases we have in how we try to address one concern, which is tax competition, which is, of course, it does create problems and should be addressed in a way. But we do it in a way that significantly allocate the tax jurisdiction to the richer nations instead of distributing it more equitably among other countries.
Indeed. Just two quick remarks on your perspectives on Pillar 1, Pillar 2. The first one on Pillar 1. I remember in a speech I made I gave in Queen's Mary University in Paris campus. A French student has criticized me for describing Brazil as a developing country in this context. So it's in line with your perspective on Pillar 1. And second, when you explain the roots of Pillar 2 discussion, it reminds me an important discussion on some literature, some authors that describes OECD as making as a buller on smaller jurisdictions, mainly Caribbean jurisdictions. I remember an author that represented the jurisdictions of the Caribbean islands, writing something like that OECD was trying to make bullying on these smaller jurisdictions, and this is a 1990s article, so probably the history is repeating itself. But yeah. Going further, your work also points out that international tax reforms are often presented as purely technical exercise, yet, as you know, they conceal deep political bargaining and power asymmetries in their core. So how can policymakers reconcile the need for technical precision, which is central in the tax discussion, it legitimizes tax discussion, with, on the other hand, the equally vital need for transparency and fairness in global tax governance?
Yes. So that's a great point, right? So we know that, as I mentioned before, most of these reforms are being advanced by the OECD. So you can only expect that they would benefit their membership, right? But the issue with that is that that's not made explicit. So if you look at the OECD's, not the OECD's, but if you look at the Pillar 2 solution documents, they often refer to fairness. So the reason why they are making these reforms is to make the tax system fairer. But is it really fairer? And what concept of fairness do they have when they use it? And I think the main issue with these reforms is that because it's so heavily politically motivated, and because there's a clear benefit to a group of countries in detriment to the others, I think it's important to make that explicit. So if it is true, and I do strongly believe it is, that there are negotiations taking place, and that's how these decisions are being made, that is, the choice for Pillar 2 to address tax competition is not the only possible solution, right? So it's a very technically complicated solution that, or at least it became very complicated throughout the years, to a problem that could be potentially addressed different ways. And the same thing for Pillar 1, right? The formula they used to assign tax jurisdiction to market countries was very specific and very arbitrary as well. And so the problem, I think, is if we have these solutions being chosen, but the rationale for them is not that clear, we need to make explicit that what we're doing is actually the result of negotiation. And by not doing that, by considering that as being technical, so they purport these reforms or these choices not to result from negotiation, but from a technical perspective. And that's, I think, what the bigger issue is. By concealing the political aspect of the proposal, through terms and language that suggest that this is the best technical alternative, that's what sort of consolidates their power, but at the same time conceals it. So I'd say that the first step would be, let's acknowledge what's at stake here, who is winning, who is losing from this. And only then we can have somewhat a fairer negotiation, or at least a more explicit one, instead of having this being hidden by the technical language that I say that some tax administrations can even really understand the implications of the technical decisions that were being made. Instead of that, let's acknowledge that this is a political negotiation, a political bargain, and let's consider what the actual distributional consequences are. So any exercise we do in international tax reform is going to change the distribution of tax jurisdictions, right? So how much each state can tax. And so these consequences are relevant. If we ignore that and just pretend that this is the technical solution and we're not really thinking about distribution, that I think is the main problem. If we at least can start from the point where we determine who is benefiting from this or not, I think the negotiation will be clearer and at least have better prospects of being fairer.
You made me, you gave me something to think about it. Let me share with you something that that occurred to me right now. Don't you think OECD is in a kind of a paradox or a conundrum in some sense? In this sense, if OECD takes in consideration the result of the distribution effects or distributional effects of these techniques developed, OECD would assume that this is a political work, this is a political decision, because it's a teleological decision or finalistic decision. I'm admitting that the best tool, the best technique to implement Pillar 2 is so because it reached a specific result in practice. So it would assume a very political dimension. And OECD justifies itself as an international tax organization, a de facto international tax organization, because of the myth of the technicality of its work. So OECD cannot allow the people understand that what they are doing is just working as a political forum for people to establish who will get what. So OECD has to cover its discourse with this technical clothes and say, no, this is the best way to preserve it's a very typical OECD's lexical, the integrity of the system, for example. Or else United Nations may say, okay, if this is a political decision, OECD is not anymore the best forum for this debate. UN would be the best forum for this debate. Don't you think that OECD is in kind of a conundrum in this sense? It dances with the technicality and the political aspects of taxation. It cannot assume that it's very political, because the more political it is, the bigger is the justification for carrying this debate to the sin of the UN. On the other hand, if you were very technical in the sense that I'm not considering the results, I have a principle, I have a technique that must be preserved in any case, we may reach some results that are not perceived as fair in the end. Don't you think that there's a kind of a puzzle that the OECD staff must face?
Absolutely. Yes, I definitely agree with that. And perhaps that points us to a direction where the OECD is really not the ideal place to have these decisions being made, right? Because they just can't. But you see that's kind of the direction we're going now. So if you look at the beginning of the BEPS project, I don't think that was that explicit, right? So the concern was, as you said, with the integrity of everyone's tax system, not only OECD countries. So the concern was much broader. And I think that was generally accepted. When we look at the stage that we're at now with the two-pillar solution, I think many people are making that argument that it is political. We didn't see that before, several years ago, with what we call BEPS 1.0, right? And so I think we are moving in a direction, and I don't think it needs to necessarily come from the OECD, but from stakeholders as overall to acknowledge that and to make that explicit. So I wouldn't say that if we, which is the other point you mentioned about, should we focus on being technical or should we focus on the distributional consequences? And we have kind of a conundrum there. I don't think that these are necessarily not compatible, right? So I think the way tax reforms have been designed by the OECD is that the purpose is not necessarily clear. So they have a problem, they have an issue they are trying to solve. This is clear. what's not clear is how did they come to the specific solution that they came, and they phrase it in a way with language that suggests that, as you said, that this was kind of the one technical solution we had for that problem, right? If we instead acknowledge that we have a problem, and that we acknowledge that any solution will have distributional consequences, and we sort of agree to how to equitably share the tax jurisdiction over the results from the reform, then we can work the technique in a way that it's still technical, but it achieves the results we're expecting. So what would change is that instead of having a single result of, let's say, addressing tax competition, would be let's address tax competition in a way that gives us this particular result or this particular distribution that is a little bit more equitable. And then we can make it technical by having rules designed around these objectives. And for sure, the OECD would be a strong place. They certainly have the expertise to be able to do that. But yeah, I'd say that these are somewhat compatible. But of course, the issue is maybe not in their best interest to do that. And on that point, I agree with you. It's very hard for them politically to just shift to that approach I'm suggesting.
Oh yeah, and this is not a specific OECD's problem. It's a historical problem between in the legal domain where we got to use that, between the source of authority and the technical source of the interpreters of the authority's decision. So OECD works like all the glossators or commentaries in the ancient law and medieval law. So you have a space to work, but you cannot go so deep or get away from the core decision of the authority, or else you may be delegitimized as a forum or as an authority. So probably this is the conundrum OECD is facing. How far can I go without losing my legitimacy as the international tax forum by excellence? So this is something that brings us to the domain of international relations, to discuss political power, international matters. So it goes a little bit further than the tax debate can leave us. But let me go back to your main argument concerning fairness. In your writings, you propose a reconceptualization of fairness in international taxation as an equitable allocation of taxing rights, resources, and responsibilities among states. In this sense, what kind of institutional mechanisms or policy tools do you believe could make such a vision achievable in practice?
I'd say that it would require a set of different moving parts, right? So first of all, we should at least have the recognition that this is important. And I think this is already controversial, at least in academia. So I've had people writing sort of trying to argue against the argument I built in these papers by saying maybe international tax is not the place to do that. Maybe international tax should be more technical, and then we should leave global justice to a different forum. And so the first point is, should we consider that global justice is important here or not? And I'd say, yes, it is. So if you consider, to simplify, in a domestic setting, if we consider how different areas of law try to accomplish justice, the way they do is that they will have some form of equitable consideration, so that the richer will get either have more responsibility or contribute more, and the poorer will benefit more because they need more. And this is enshrined in most areas of law in the domestic setting. If you go to the international level, even among philosophers, there are disagreements about how much duties of global justice different countries have, but we do have examples from other areas of law. If you look at intellectual property, if you look at environment, we do have principles that suggests that developing countries, for example, should have differentiated treatment, right? So in trade law, we have that. In environmental law, we have a specific principle that's called the CBDR principle, which stands for common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. The idea being all of us share this common goal of addressing climate change, but we should share the responsibilities based on the level of responsibilities each country's had in creating the problem, but also in the level of capabilities they have in addressing the problem. So if you look at different kind of subsystems at the international level, you do have that consideration about justice. But then when you get to international tax, we absolutely ignore that, right? No. And so when people talk about fairness in tax, in international tax, they will often say, you know, fairness is such a broad and vague concept that's very hard to choose one of them. And I can agree with that. I agree that fairness is broad, but I don't think it's broad enough for you to see a system that actually gives more rights to richer countries than to poor countries, and say that this is according to fairness. So even though fairness cannot make us or guide us to create a very specific system, it at least should detract us from having some systems that are clearly unfair, clearly inequitable, which is the system we have today, right? And so I do believe that justice should be relevant in international tax, at least to delimit, let's say, reforms, as is the case we're seeing now, that are clearly unfair and clearly inequitable. Right? So I'd say the first step is to recognize that, to acknowledge that. The second would be to just have language for it. So until, I don't know, maybe 5 years or 10 years from now, we didn't see so many writings about that and people making that argument that one, or sometimes we would see people arguing that the system is unfair, but not people arguing that there's something we should do and we could do about it, right? So usually you have criticism, but no language to determine what kind of principle could we use to argue for a different system. You would only have criticism. And so what we've been seeing in the literature in more recent years is more and more people developing arguments in the language to make that argument of how the system could be changed to make it fairer. And so by creating that language, you create that space for countries that should be entitled to make those arguments to make them. So I'd say that first is we need to acknowledge that this exists and that we should have global justice considerations in international tax. Second would be to create the language and the framework to make that argument. And then third would be to have the legitimacy space for these discussions to take place. And I'm happy to see that this is sort of what's happening now. If you look at the African states, how much more they have grown in terms of their claims for more taxing powers, this has increased significantly in the very few recent years. And so just that's a direction, right? So I don't think there's a clear formula for what a fair tax system should be, but we know that that's not the system we currently have. So by creating that language and that opportunity for less developed countries to be able to make those claims and to have the political space to do so, and I think what's happening at the UN shows that this is feasible, or at least it gives us hope that this could happen. That's how we implement a fairer system.
Professor, in spite of all the difficulties in defining what is fair or not in international tax system or international tax field, and summarize your thoughts, do you believe that the current institutional arrangement of OECD and the United Nations can build a fair international tax order, or it is necessary any deeper institutional transformation, perhaps even a new multilateral framework for that? Do you believe it is feasible with the current tools or not?
Yeah, feasibility is very hard to assess, right? Yeah. I have always tried to run away from these kind of predictions because it's so hard. So if you asked me maybe 4 years ago, or even maybe 2 years ago, if the UN would ever try to become a tax body that would replace the OECD, I would say this is impossible. I would never imagine that happening, and we're seeing that this is happening, right? Because in the end, it really depends broadly on the political space that these countries have and the interest they have in pursuing their interests. And we see this happening, right? So I do have high hopes for the UN. I think it's still very difficult because you still have so many countries involved, and developed countries as well, and the OECD as well, trying to exercise power over the UN. So one idea that has been raised in the literature is to have maybe regional blocks, such as, you know, a group of African countries trying to develop their own policies, and that maybe multiply. The digital services tax is another interesting example where you don't have necessarily a coordination, but by having multiple countries trying to advance this in the same direction, perhaps we could then reach harmonization in a different way. So it started from a more unilateral policy, and then it expands into a more coordinated one instead of a top-down approach, which is what we have with the OECD, and which is what the UN is kind of trying to purport as well, right? So perhaps the movement instead of top-down to bottom up might be an interesting possibility as well. Very hard to predict, right? But I do think the direction we're going is much better than I would ever imagine just a few years ago.
I see, Professor. We have a lot to discuss on that subject, but unfortunately, our time is running out. But I would like to ask you a final question. For policymakers like myself, academics and professionals in the tax field following this discussion, what message would you leave about the importance of embedding fairness and distributive justice at the center of the global tax reform?
I'd say if you do believe that we should have a juster, more equitable system, don't give up, and continue writing about it, continue talking about it, because what we need right now is to have language. As you know, the language we have today for international tax is from more than 100 years ago, where the people who had voice was mostly, you know, the largest and richer economies that were voicing and creating the language that ends up today benefiting wealthier countries. So the more we talk about this topic, and I really appreciate you giving me this space and creating this forum where we can discuss these things, I think that's how we develop, by just discussing these and writing about these things, and trying to create the language and the framework for a more equitable international tax system.
Indeed, Professor. Professor Ozai, thank you very much indeed for your time and for sharing your insights with us today. The way you conduct your research aligns and resonates with the way we see the international tax debate here at the ESTB. So it has been a real pleasure to hear your perspective on such a timely and profound topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Marcio. It's really a great pleasure to be in your channel.
Of course. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. And for those that are interested in the articles we have discussed today, the first one is Global Justice in the Reshaping of International Tax. It was published in the Journal of International Economic Law, 2024, volume 27, issue 4, pages 639 to 645. And the second one, the most recent one, is Beyond Economical Allegiancy, University of Toronto Law Journal, 2025, volume 75, issue 4, pages 425, 465. And don't forget to like this video, to subscribe to the channel, and to activate notifications so you won't miss the next episode of the ESTB interview, which will take place in a couple of weeks. And especially for our international audience, I highly recommend revisiting our previous episodes. Although many of them focus on the Brazilian context, they cover issues that resonate globally, especially Brazil's ongoing consumption tax reform, which has significant implications for multinational enterprises and for comparative tax policy debates worldwide. So our next episode will be in 2 weeks. I hope to see you all then. So thank you so much. Until next time.
Thank you.